All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our California wildfire safety webinar. We'll get started here in about 8 minutes. We're going to try to start right on time so that we can get through all the presentations and maybe have time for a few questions at the end. So thank you all for joining early, and we'll start in about 8 minutes. Hello everyone, thank you for joining the webinar. We will get started in just about 5 minutes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. We will get started in just about 3 minutes now. Hello, everyone. Looks like people are flooding in right now, so we'll give everyone just one more minute, and then we'll get started. Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining the California Wildfire Safety webinar. My name is Daniel Barad. I am an organizer and policy advocate at Sierra Club, California. I work on a lot of forest issues. We've been doing a number of webinars in this weird time where we have a lot of people who are locked up at home, just like us. And so we figured this was a great time to keep our members educated on educated on issues that are affecting the entire state. So today we have Richard Halsey, who's the director of the California Chaparral Institute. He's going to give a background on Chaparral, first of all. Excuse me. and then he'll get into how homes catch on fire and a little bit into some of what can make a difference in the situation of wildfire and the occurrence of a wildfire. And then we have Bob Roper and Kate Dargan of California Fire Safe Council, and they are going to present on some things, if you're living in the foothills, what you can do to protect yourself from a wildfire, and some resources that are available to you, especially in this time of COVID-19. So if you have any questions, please type them in the question box throughout the presentation. That will allow me to consolidate. If there's a number of questions that are the same, I can consolidate them into one, and then I'll have those ready to go at the end of the presentation, and I can ask our panelists the questions, assuming that we have some time left at the end to do that. So again, thank you very much for joining, and without further ado, Mr. Rick Halsey, take it away.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, this is Rick, and I'm with the California Chaparral Institute. We're a nonprofit educational outfit that tries to help people reconnect with nature and live safely with fire, and that's why we're here today. So I want to start off with just the thought that actually we're part of nature rather than a part of nature. And it's better to look at living with the environment itself rather than trying to live against it, which is sort of our go-to position in a lot of situations. So once we learn that the natural environment, which most of us enjoy, is not the enemy, we can find out how to live much more safely than is often currently the case. Daniel, I'll just say next when we go to the next slide. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, let's go next. Yeah, thank you. So just talking about fire in particular, each ecosystem has its own fire regime or fire pattern. And there's basically 2 fire regimes in California and actually across the world. Next. We have a mixed severity fire regime and a crown fire regime. Next. Mixed severity fire regimes are basically in forests. Not all forests, but some forests, where you get a patchwork of fire where you may have several hundred acres or more, sometimes 1,000 acres of just absolute blackened ground with all the trees that are burned as just black stumps. And then you have patches that aren't burned at all. And the picture you see there is a picture of the rim fire, which is pretty typical of most forested systems that people often talk about. The next fire regime, next, is the crown fire regime, and that typically is found in Chaparral. And when the fire comes through, it burns everything to the ground. There's nothing left, and that's a perfectly natural event. Oftentimes people refer to it as a moonscape or whatever, and it shouldn't have happened. Well, actually, it does happen naturally, and that's the way it works. Unfortunately, we build homes in these kinds of fire regime environments, and so that's when we get into trouble. Next. There's also some forests that have crown fire regimes, like the Yellowstone forest, the lodgepole pine forests out there. A lot of people lost their careers and jobs because of that Yellowstone fire in '88, because they blamed the Park Service for mismanagement. But actually, the fire that happened in Yellowstone is perfectly natural. Lodgepole pine forests are very dense, and when they burn in crown fire regimes, which, just like Chaparral, are perfectly normal, but they take out large swaths of landscape, and people don't like that, especially folks that are concerned about timber and that kind of thing. But that, again, is a natural system. Next. So we focus particularly on Chaparral, and it's very relevant to this discussion today, this webinar, because Chaparral is California's most extensive wildland. It's in every single county in the state, probably except for Sacramento. And it used to be there, however. And unfortunately, we put a lot of homes in this environment, and we haven't quite understood where we live. So we keep fighting against it and instead of trying to live with it. So just to repeat here, the Chaparral has a crown fire regime. Next. So this is the same environment, same kid. He kind of resprouted there. A lot of people look at this environment and they say, Well, that's horrible. That's just it's just a devastated landscape. It's a catastrophe. Well, it is that people have died and homes have burned, but naturally speaking, this is exactly the way chaparral should burn. And just simply put, the bigger the chaparral fires, the better, because hot fires scarify the seeds, which allow them to naturally germinate when the next winter rainfall comes. Also, it takes out any non-native weeds. They can't tolerate that high intensity fire. So this is the way it's supposed to be. Next. But the problem we have is now there's just too many fires in chaparral. And this picture here basically shows an area that's burned in different time periods. The whole area got burned in 1970 in the Laguna Fire. This is San Diego County, if you're familiar with that area. This is off the Highway 8 near the Ahos Indian Reservation. The middle section all the way back burned in the 1970 Laguna Fire. Also, the 2001 Viejas fire, which was a January wind-blown fire. It was quite interesting the way it burned. The lower right-hand corner, though, burned in 2003 again with the Cedar Fire. And as you can see in the picture, what's coming up is, well, you can look at it and see it. It's just basically weeds. It's devastated the chaparral community. There's not enough time for the chaparral to recover. So basically, non-native weeds fill in the gaps. And that's happened throughout California, especially Southern California. And this environment with the grassy fuels is much more flammable than chaparral. And essentially most chaparral fires and most fires in general in California start in these grassy fuels because they ignite so readily. Next. So what's the outcome of this? Well, basically, if you just remember the number here, anything less than 15 to 20 years apart in terms of fire frequency leads to multiple problems. Next. Reduced biodiversity, reduced watershed function. In other words, you get a lot of flooding, a lot of mass wasting. That's what happened in the Montecito fire, the Montecito flood that happened after the Thomas fire. Weedy grasslands, which is referred to as type conversions. You converted chaparral native shrublands to weedlands, and that in turn increases fire risk. So ironically, the more you have, the more fire risky this environment becomes. And I want to just bounce back up to number one there really quickly. Reduce biodiversity. You know, this type conversion issue happens in stages. You keep hammering chaparral over and over, and what starts happening, you start losing particular components like ceanothus and manzanita. And what happens is the shrubs that depend on fire cues for their germination, in particular, eventually drop out of the system. So although it may be green and may have shrubs, you've reduced a lot of biodiversity with increased fire frequency. Next. So this is a statewide phenomena, and basically you have two Californias. You have Southern California and Central California with those orange and yellow colors. This is a U.S. Forest Service map that shows areas that have more fire than the system can tolerate, which is basically all of Central and Southern California. The blue areas are areas that have missed fire cycles. In other words, they have a fire deficit, and that's most of the Sierra and Northern California. But I want to emphasize here that does not mean we need to get in there and start burning things. What we need to do is, in many areas, just stop doing fire suppression and let these systems recover naturally. A lot of folks want to go in and do logging and thinning so that fires in their parlance don't create crown fire events. That really often is much more complicated than they think. But the message I want to leave here is that basically you have two Californias and we cannot mix the two together. What happens up in Northern California has very little to do with Southern California. Next. And to emphasize this point, I put all the fires in California that have caused basically one or more fatalities and 500 or more structures lost. If you take a look at where they are, they basically have nothing to do with forests, except for the Camp Fire, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The Car Fire also had some forested components, Mendocino also, but the really devastating fires are basically, if you look at them, they're in shrubland areas, and they have next to nothing to do with dead trees, which is a talking point that you continually hear about how we've got to take care of these dead trees, otherwise the state's going to explode. They really, in a general view don't create that much of a fire risk in terms of what devastation we've been seeing in California. The problem is basically we're building in flammable environments. So just take a look at that map and realize that most of these devastating fires have little or nothing to do with forested systems, and they have nothing to do with dead trees. The Ferguson fire, there was one fatality there in 2018. It was a firefighter that was killed by a falling branch from a snag, which is a burned tree. But other than that, that's really the only dead tree environment that burned that actually caused some devastation. Okay, next. So how do we respond to all this? Well, first of all, it seems to be a blame game a lot of times, and most of us are familiar with that. Next. There's a lot of commentary in newspapers and stuff. This fellow up in Santa Barbara County basically blamed bureaucrats, politicians, activists, meaning folks like myself, and even the fire agencies for these big fires. And he thought that they ought to be prosecuted for homicide. This is the Thomas fire. This fire was a wind-driven fire. There was absolutely nothing that could have been done to have prevented that. When the winds blow, the fire is going to burn until it either runs into the ocean or it runs kind of non-fuel situation, such as a lake like that, or the weather changes. Next. So I want to look at this area a little closer. This is a map of Ventura, and what you're looking at, all those different colored polygons are areas that have burned before the Thomas fire. The Thomas fire there is that kind of red elongated shape in the first couple of days of the fire itself. And the blue areas, though, interestingly enough, are prescribed burns. I concentrate on the Ventura area. Next. So there's that one area there that had the prescribed burn, and the next picture is going to show you the houses that burned in the Thomas fire. So let's go to the next one, Daniel. Okay, so those are the homes that were burned. And what this graphic's telling you is when you have a wind-driven fire, the embers that are generated by these catastrophic events, they either go around or over or airborne prescribed burns or previous fuel treatments. And the homes burn anyway, because understand the thing that's flammable actually is the house itself. And so until you address that, continue to have losses like this if you continue to focus almost exclusively on habitat clearance operations. Next. So you get other things in the newspapers actually that kind of ramp up the blame game. This was in a environmental newspaper, remarkably. Shrub-choked wildlands played a role in California fires, in the 2007 fires, up in Napa up there. Next. So let's look at this shrub-filled environment that was choking all the landscapes. This is basically a patchwork of grasslands and suburban development and a few shrubs. Next. This is Santa Rosa, by the way. Here's the Tubbs fire. And next. And you can see it was about 5 miles away from any really wildland that was considered dense. So these headlines are not helpful. Next. And the fire eventually ended up in Coffee Park. It jumped the 101 and it devastated that community, which was far from any wildland at all. So the problem is not these wildlands, it's the flammable communities. Next. So shrublands are dense. There's nothing we can do about that. That's just part of the system. And to pretend that they're not going to be that way and to think that that's a manageable situation is really not realistic. It's not the forest parkland environment that people often think about. Next. And the issue is planning. Let's hit the next button. This is the origin of the Hanley fire in 1964, I believe, and it burned right across the Santa Rosa area. That area ended up an area now that's occupied by the Fountain Grove development. Next. This is the Tubbs fire that came next, and this is the new development process that came through. You can see right down at the bottom there, there's a lot of development. This is the Fountain Grove development. Next. So there's the Tubbs fire, and it went right into Fountain Grove. Next. Turn Fountain Grove, as you see here. Next. Into that. Totally predictable. Why that was allowed is beyond me. It's about money and development. You had a fire that went there before that did the same thing, and here we have loss of life and loss of tremendous numbers of property values, and frankly, it's inexcusable. Next. So how do fires really work? Next. So the thing I want to emphasize here, it's all about embers. It's not about fire fronts for the most part. As the fire front moves in, next. The embers jump out of the fire front. They get stopped by some vegetation. Sometimes they end up in the attics. And there you go. So that's how homes ignite. It's not about flame fronts like people often think about. Next. So the research has shown that most homes in these fires ignite long before the fire front even gets there. In fact, almost all homes ignite from embers. Next. And the Paradise situation up there when the campfire burned Paradise, it burned through 10-year-old vegetation. Next. It wasn't a dense fire forest at all. In fact, it had a lot of salvage logged areas and whatnot. So it wasn't this dense landscape that people think about. So things are much more complicated than often you hear in the newspaper. Next. And there's a trailer park area that got burned in the Paradise situation there with the campfire. You can see most of the forest around it's fine. How these trailers ignite? Well, from embers that ignited flammable structures. So no amount of logging is going to prevent that. Next. So this answer that people often have is, well, it's just clear nature. That's really not the answer. Next. Because what we found is any more than 100 feet is really counterproductive in terms of vegetation management, even on steep slopes. Next. And oftentimes what you have is you create a weedy environment like you see in the background with soil disturbance, which creates a more flammable environment than you had in the first place. Next. So the issue is this. Next. Embers get up into these urban fuels. Next. Sparks fly everywhere. Next. And they ignite homes. So the issue is urban fuels. Next. It's not about wildland areas. We've got to maintain some sort of situation where you can reduce the flammability in communities. Next. So here's the basic message here. Next. This home had all of the bells and whistles, but it burned anyway in the Poinsettia fire several years ago in San Diego County. So we've got to go from the house out in terms of how we respond to reducing the flammability of our homes. Make the home fire safe, then start thinking about defensible space. But until you do the house, defensible space is not really going to help. Next. And I just want to leave you with this one thought. This landscape, next, actually habitat, not fuel. And if we look at our homes as fuel instead of just these innocent victims sort of getting burned down, it'll change the equation to create a much more effectively fire-safe environment. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Rick. And next we're gonna have Bob Roper present. I just wanted to say, it looks like, well, we might have time for a question or two, but we are gonna run a little short on time, I think. So if you have questions, I'll send a follow-up email after this, and you can send me an email with your questions, and I can get you in touch with Bob or Kate or Rick and get some answers for you. So just wanted to say that. Thank you very much. And here's Bob.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Roper. I'm co-chair with Kate Dargan with California Fire Safe Council. What we wanted to do was just kind of set the stage for where we are today. And you know why this is important is because there's nobody listening that has incurred a pandemic at the same time of a wildland season. And so it's one of those things that's important that we as homeowners, emergency managers, and fire service professionals all think about all the what if situations in preparation, response, and recovery. Next slide. When that goes right now is the state has enacted a burn ban, and it's not that anybody's against burning. Burning can be sometimes the most cost-effective and constructive ways, but there's a time and place for everything. And with all the uncertainties of smoke management and so forth, that's what you've seen. But our challenges are right now is how to do inspections, how to deal with defensible space and community mitigation projects. Early on, the governor did create a document and orders and identify what are essential functions. Essential functions in the state were clearly identified as doing preemptive, proactive work. This can be done by contractors or the homeowners. So recognize the social distancing and stay at home, but there's other alternatives. With that, there's different things like we go into more details on the use of retardants, gels, and foams around your home. And if you go to our website at the California Fire Safe Council, you'll see a document we created to try to give some advice on what to do during this time. Next slide. This is a graphic from our website. Then what we talked, which is consistent with what Rick talked about, is start from the center of your house. Think about number one, yourself. Implement the Ready, Set, Go program to become aware of what the fire situation is that you're living in, that environment. Prepare yourself, get your go pack ready, and when the law enforcement comes by to tell you to evacuate, either leave before that or leave when they tell you to. But part of that is the preemptive stuff of doing the preparation of your home, of home hardening, the 0 to 5 foot clear zone, and so forth. As you do with that, even at stay at home, start working your way out to the 100-foot defensible space, home hardening, and so forth. Help your neighbors. And then, if you can, work further with your community. And like we said, with essential functions, you can still do shaded fuel breaks and other things to make your environment fire adaptive. Next slide. These are some of the response challenges that we just wanted to kind of highlight for you so that you know as the homeowner is that the response agencies are going to be quite challenged this year. The largest amount of firefighters in the nation are volunteers. If they're told to stay at home or they don't have jobs, you can see that's going to affect that. It's going to affect mutual aid and so forth. So there's a variety of things that have been put into place this year as far as the federal government has done early contracts for aerial assets for helicopters and fixed wing. So they'll be used earlier on, and they'll be sizing up the type of fires and how to deal with that. But we also have the challenges of what to do for evacuations. As an emergency manager gives that order, where do we take and put people that we need to evacuate? Yesterday in the media, it was talked about the Red Cross may give hotel vouchers. Some of these things work fine for a small neighborhood, but not for the large scale. It may be that people are just told to stay in their cars in a large remote parking lot. But the Red Cross will also be challenged on how to deal with social distancing, how to have more and larger refuge centers to go to. So when we look at these, the response agencies are going to be quite challenged. And just when you thought things were bad, it got worse, as yesterday there was a 6.4 earthquake in Tonopah, Nevada. Imagine if that hit somewhere in California. At the same time, we have a wildfire and we're trying to deal with stay at home. Next slide. So when recovery after every fire, what emergency managers want to do is try to get the people repopulated back into their homes. But in the past, we've always tried to make sure that it's safe, that they have power, water, and so forth. You may see things done differently this year where we allow people to stay in their RVs and so forth, just camp. But there's going to be a lot of creative things done. Also with the recovery challenges, just like the community of Paradise is going through now, the budget deficits, the economic impacts of the response to the pandemic, what it's doing at the federal, state, and local level may impact us even further along the way. Next slide. So what we really want you to do as homeowners, members of your community, and the other functions that you perform is go down a list like this and ask yourself, what if this were to happen? We all know that when as much as we don't want things to happen, they do happen. We have to think about things, improvise and overcome, and we have to be flexible in what we do. The biggest thing for public apprehension is to try to avoid the fear of what the situation is and think of it more as an opportunity for people to think outside the box. And going into this year, our number one thing is that the people who live in these hazard areas are actually the key to making a difference for us in the future. That concludes my presentation. Back to you, Dan.
All right, thank you very much, Bob. And Kate, are you ready to go?
Thank you, Daniel. I am. And Daniel, how long would you like me to take with the next set of slides before you wrap up?
You can just take, I don't think it's going to kick us off. As long as we're done before like 1:45, I think we'll be okay.
Okay. All right. That should leave enough time for questions. So go ahead and advance. Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Dargan. I am a longtime CAL FIRE firefighter from 1977 to 2009. I then retired from that position, and one of the things I do in my volunteer work is I serve as the co-chair for the California Fire Safe Council with Bob Roper. So I'll talk a little bit about what the Fire Safe Council is, and then kind of circle back to what you can be doing this year, even with shelter in place or stay at home restrictions in your community. So we're calling this today Prepare at Home. Since you're likely to stay at home for a good part of the summer, you can prepare at home. Next. So the Fire Safe Council, we've been around for 25 years in California. We're a statewide nonprofit organization that advocates for wildfire mitigation. We were originally formed by a CAL FIRE chief, Bruce Turbyville, in our early days, and started a grassroots movement that has resulted in hundreds of local fire safe councils all over California, and even the concept of fire safe advocacy groups, grassroots groups across the country. We have currently a 15-member board of directors from around the state that represent a number of different perspectives, from fire service, forestry groups, insurance, utilities, let's see, trying to think of a few others. But at any rate, a wide variety of members that come from different disciplines. And our goal is to eliminate catastrophic wildfire. Wildfire itself is, as Rick pointed out, a part of our natural environment over most of the ecosystems in California. So we don't want to eliminate wildfire by any means. There is a role and a place for wildfire in our state, and we need it. However, what we would like to eliminate is the impact, the catastrophic impact to the human and environmental communities that go way above and beyond what sustainable could account for. Next. So building local grassroots wildfire mitigation groups. Many of you, I don't know where all the participants in today's webinar reside, but chances are that there is either a FireWise community, a fire adapted community, or a fire safe council operating near or in your neighborhood. The other things that the Fire Safe Council does is we help coordinate state and federal and private grants and turn around and efficiently streamline those and try to get them out to the various small groups around the state and make the administrative process for grant management as efficient as possible, so the most money is going to on the ground projects, and is streamlined so that small volunteer groups can actually bring projects to their community without being overwhelmed by bureaucracy. Next. So prepare at home, I'm going to circle back utilizing a couple of sources that I'll emphasize. I'll give you the links to those at the end of my slide set. But I want to go back to what Bob was saying, which is, you know, a bit of good news, bad news. The bad news is, yep, we're all going to deal with stay at home to some degree over this wildfire season. The good news is that that absolutely will not impact your safety or your ability to do the things that prepare you for wildfire at home. We'll talk a little bit today about some of the building features like roof coverings and gutters. These are the building environment features that you can think about changing with your house, all the way down to creating defensible space. And I'm going to emphasize today an emerging concept, which is called the 0 to 5 foot zone in and around the house. Next. The sources that we're using today that you'll see on your slides are available at 2 places. One is a set of brochures that the Fire Safe Council has put out over the last few years. I believe they're available on our website. And Daniel, we're happy to send those to you in PDF form if you'd like to send them to your membership. And secondly, an excellent presentation on retrofitting homes, not presentation, but brochure from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And I'll provide you the link for that you can go directly to. Both of them are chock full of practical advice that I'm just going to spend a few minutes on today. Next. So to start off with, in terms of your home, the roof is your greatest vulnerability at this point. Roofs and your eave or vents rather. So first off, you want to make sure that no matter what kind of material you have covering your roof, with the exception of wood shakes, in which you're highly vulnerable and need to have those changed out as quickly as you can afford that, just make sure that the tiles or the shingles or whatever your roof covering is in good shape and doesn't have gaps or holes in it or cupping so that embers can get underneath. You also need to try to provide gaps protection, whether it's flashing or bird stops, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. You want to make sure that you've eliminated as many gaps within your roofing structure as possible. Next. I'm going to show you a couple pictures here. Roofs are one of the more vulnerable aspects of a house to the embers that Rick was explaining, are your most likely source of ignition. So when you stand outside and you look at your house, really take a look at where small embers can gather. Here's an example on the left where people have installed bird stops at the end of those tile roof runs, and you can see what a problem that would be. Embers can collect under there, and while the tile itself isn't flammable, the underlying sheathing often is, because there's usually a plywood component to a roof underneath, and that can gather up in there, form a little bed of coals, and start to burn through the roof itself. So stopping those gaps up with commercially available bird stops. And on the second, people have started to talk about skylights. Skylights become vulnerable because the embers collect in and around them, especially on flatter roofs versus steeper roofs. So one of the things that you'll need to be doing every summer is frequently sweeping your roof off so that your needles or leaves don't aggregate in the corners or the top level of skylight structures, in the valleys where your roof collects, or in the gutters themselves. Next. The other things, and this isn't just directly out of one of the brochures, the other things to pay attention to are vents. If you can change out the screening, the 1/4-inch screening on your vents to a minimum of 1/8 inch, or there are even some commercially available vent replacement options, change out your vent screening or the vent itself. Eaves and soffits, make sure there's no vegetation under them. They do collect heat and spin that back around to make the house vulnerable. Windows require double pane, one with a tempered glass. That also correlates with energy efficiency. So we've aligned the energy efficient requirements for windows with the fire resistive requirements. Garages, that's one of the ones that emerged in the 2017 fires and the Camp Fire, which is to make sure that there's a gasket on the bottom of your door and gaskets along the side of the door so that there aren't big gaps around the garage door itself, and then know how to operate your particular garage door when there is no power. And then lastly, here's one that's very important. People are just kind of waking up to this through the damage assessment process, but if you have a wooden fence and it attaches to your house, that first 6 feet or so of that fence is an ignition source, an ignition pathway to your siding. So replace that with a non-combustible fencing material like a wire gate, metal gate, etc., as it runs into your house. Next. So creating defensible space. Another component, both the building features and the defensible space need to go hand in glove. Next. One of the things that people have begun to zone it out. Several years ago, CAL FIRE just talked about defensible space up to 30 feet, then 100 feet, but not every part of that area is going to be treated exactly the same. So today we're really going to focus on that 0 to 5 foot. Next. Because one of the things that has emerged with the damage assessment is if you can maintain a non-combustible zone within 5 feet directly surrounding your house, you will increase your chances of survivability, even if you don't have some of the other building features. That 0 to 5 foot will be very effective. Now that's a real big change for many of us because we're used to planting shrubbery immediately adjacent to our house. And if we can start to turn that back and pull away in that 5 foot space around the house with a non-combustible material, gravel is often the one of choice, decomposed granite, things that we can set plants on in terms of irrigated container plants. It doesn't mean you just have to have a flat, non-combustible tiling running your decking like concrete patio or non-flammable decking material against the house, but to create a non-combustible zone around the house. Next. Again, as you move away with your 5 to 30 feet, these are the things that you may be, you've heard for a number of years. You don't have to completely remove all vegetation, but you do need to take the woody vegetation out, the dead vegetation. You need to mow down to a distance of 4 feet. Make sure that the pine needles and small branches are loosely scattered and raked away from the house. You still want to have some mulching ground cover because that's good for soil moisture, etc. And make sure you don't have wood piles up near the house within that 5 foot. Get them farther away from the structure. Next, Daniel. So just a couple of examples that I wanted to share. The UC Master Gardeners in a number of counties have started to teach courses. This one in particular is available on the internet. It's an excellent PowerPoint presentation about landscaping specific for defensible space with native shrubbery and some other, whether it's deer resistive or other landscaping values that we have as well. Next. So I wanted to point you to just a couple of visual examples of what would be considered optimum fire resistive landscapes that accommodate the 0 to 5 foot and a well landscaped, ember resistant configuration of plants. Again, you can find some of these brochures at the CaliforniaFireSafeCouncil.org website, the Institute for Business and Home Safety, their research wildfire handouts, and then in this particular example, the Sonoma UCC Cooperative Extension Master Gardeners website. And Daniel, any of those we can share back with you for dissemination to your group.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kate and Bob and Rick. Thank you, all of you. And thank you to all the attendees. It doesn't even look like we lost anyone despite going a few minutes late. So the first question I have is a super easy one. Kate, Rick, and Bob, would you all be okay if I sent this PowerPoint out to all the attendees today?
Certainly.
Rick, is that good with you?
Sure.
Good with me.
All right, awesome. And then another one that I know Bob talked a little bit about, but it was mostly raising how much of a challenge it's going to be. Do you have any idea of what people are talking about when it comes to safely evacuating during the lockdown?
No, the best thing we can tell people now is prepare your home first and evacuate as soon as you can. And the reason why I can't give you a black and white answer is because every situation's a little different based on weather, topography, and the fuels. But practice, read up on Ready, Set, Go, and practice its tenets early.
Awesome. Looks like one of the authors of the UC Davis Master Gardener program is on the webinar and says thanks for the shout out. That's awesome.
I do want to commend her because it's a very, very nicely done synopsis. So kudos, Linda.
And we have a question. What can you do if your neighbors won't groom their palm trees?
Well, the best thing you can do is try to be neighbor to neighbor. But if all else fails, you can also contact your local fire agency to see what local ordinances and so forth, if they can try to convince the neighbor also, or go through an enforcement program.
I would also add, that the palm trees in and of themselves are risky. We know that untrimmed palms, tend to blow around. However, there's going to be a lot of other materials, so it's not your only risk. So I would say, like Bob said, try to find neighborly ways or utilizing the fire agencies or community groups to educate your neighbor. On the other hand, don't assume they're the only ones that are subjecting your house to a risk, because there are many things that will contribute to embers.
And is there any state or federal funding to help with the expensive upgrades for houses?
Well, many of you probably saw the unfortunate impact to the state budget when the governor had to delete the 24 million plus the federal matching funds to 100 million for building retrofits for this year's budget. So there was almost some great starts. Yes, there is still some money. OES, through their disaster mitigation funds, are still ramping up grants for some home hardening projects. So I don't think it will disappear completely, but it's certainly going to take a setback due to the COVID-19 environment.
The other thing people can do is contact their local insurance agency. And a lot of the insurance companies have small grants and different incentives to try to accomplish this.
Awesome. All right. So I think that's all the time we have right now. I think we got to most of the questions. If I missed your question, please do. I'll send a follow-up email with the PowerPoint presentations. And please do reply to that email and ask me the question then, and I will get you an answer, I promise. Thank you all so much for joining. And again, thank you, Bob, Kate, and Rick for taking the time to do this. I think it was an incredibly informative presentation. I hope everyone on it enjoyed. Enjoy your.
Our pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.